Well, perhaps we'll start then. And thanks everyone for joining this morning, and particularly for those who think it's a holiday here in South Africa. So we are very delighted to have Dr. Penny Vera-Sanso with us. She is a colleague, a friend, and we've been working with her for some years now. She's a senior lecturer in international development and anthropology at Birkbeck, the University of London. I'm sure many of you know her well. She's an anthropologist with over 3 decades experience researching later life in rural and urban India. And I'm sure over that time has led many projects. And what's fantastic with her work is, how her empirical research is grounded really in the interrogation of ageism embedded in academic theorizing and public and policy discourses. And it's exactly that we are looking at. Her 2 papers that she wrote, 2 chapters, that we have shared and circulated, and that you will note the types of questions and provocative critique that she applies to often things that are very taken for granted in many circles in this area. So, as I mentioned, we have been working with her for several years now. She was part of the GACRF-funded Southern African Network on Care of Older Persons across the region, researching later life. She worked specifically with Thandi Shabalala on one particular paper there on Lesotho's men's experience of care and caring of the life course. But she worked with all of us in thinking through our papers and our arguments and our work, and drawing many parallels with her vast experience. So I'm delighted to have Penny today with us in the room. Thanks, Penny, so much for joining us. In terms of structure, what we're going to do is Penny's going to speak for about 20-25 minutes or so, outlining, how she came to this work, what she's doing with it, and then specifically in these papers or whatever. And then we will have a discussion. So we have Jasmine, Gwen, Janet, and myself asking kind of questions, and hopefully in dialogue for maybe 3 to 4 minutes each with Penny, following her presentation. After that, we'll open it up to everybody. We'll happily receive questions either in the chat or, hands up or whatever, just raise your hand. So thanks everyone again for joining. I'll hand over to Penny.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes? Yep.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the invite and for the very generous introduction. I make some confessions straight off to adjust expectations, manage expectations. I have actually got another presentation to do on Tuesday. So these 2 have got a bit conflated in my mind, but I think what I've got for you is helpful. And the reason why I've done it the way I have is because I want it to be recognized, and I'm sure you have, that what I have to say in those 2 papers don't just apply to the discipline of demography or to families in India, and could be applied to a lot of different contexts and actually subject matter. So it's more about an approach rather than specifically the subject matter. And as Elena said, my approach is very much shaped by the fact that when I did my undergraduate degree, I went and did a joint degree between anthropology and international development. And they are so diametrically opposed in terms of their viewpoint of, what is out there. So, the positivist versus the constructivist approach. And that couldn't but make me constantly aware of the way people look at things rather than taking things for granted, for received wisdom and just accepting it. So I'll go through this presentation, which normally I would have photographs and so to make it a bit more colorful, but this is just straight as it is. And then we can have discussions about the specific pieces. But in terms of why I did this why I got interested in older people, was I actually went to India to do research in low-income settlements on women's employment and so on. And then I realized that what I was seeing in the households and who were being employed, like older women, was just completely against the grain of what received wisdom. And so that kicked me off into gerontology. And of course, gerontology is a subject that sits between positivism and constructivism. Okay, so let's move on with the presentation, please. Okay, hang on, I've got something little I'm going to get rid of that's in the way. So, as I said, I'm trying to make a sort of generalized argument. So both the pre-circulated papers take on power of representation to shape the world. So that's the thing that sort of gets me out of bed when I write paper is, you know, is what people are reading and what is being said in the public arena, is it what's actually happening, and is it shaping the world in particular kind of ways? So these two papers are examples of what is happening everywhere. So the first one, Aging and Development, challenges the discipline of demography, and specifically demographic transition theory, but I'm sure there are other disciplines and theories that, you know, could be approached in the same way. And then, of course, the Indian family one is about how family discourse is political discourse, and it doesn't reflect culture, but attempts to create culture, to shape culture. So if we can move on. So what I feel my work is about working towards a decolonial sociology of aging, which I call DSA, because we, you know, it's never a process that stops. It will go on forever. Okay. And what it starts with, must start with, is reflexivity, which is looking at ourselves and thinking about, why do I think like I do? And how do I see myself? Do I see myself as representative of the norm, or a valued norm, or the numerical norm? And how is my social position and my personal experiences shape the way I think, and what I expect, my underlying assumptions? And then also the public discourse in which we're all embedded. Public discourse attempts to shape what should be happening. But it's very easy to mistake the assertions within public discourse as universals, or as culture, or as contemporary values, etc. So, and one of the things I find quite interesting is that, you know, I get asked in India to do presentations in India and to compare the situation in India to Britain. And my mouth always drops open, because I think I've never studied Britain. I just live here. I know this tiny slice that I live in. And I'm probably, you know, I haven't analyzed the public discourse, etc. I can't talk about Britain because I haven't put that work in. I haven't done the sort of reflexivity around those things that would be of concern. So one of the things that we need to think about is our ontological position, and whether we see the world as, you know, constructed, or whether we go for a midpoint of critical realism, or if we're on the other end where we think it's a, you know, take a realist position, a positivist position, where we think that there are facts out there that are not shaped by culture, but are just really there. And this, of course, depends on your training. So, you know, for myself, anthropology is very constructivist, whereas international development feels that, you know, the way they see the world is the way the world is. So they take a very positivist approach. And so in looking at ourselves in you know, taking a reflexive approach, we need to identify our ignorances, our blind spots, our biases, and we need to correct them, be willing to correct them, to see that actually that's the way we see things. So we go to the next slide. So again, in working towards a DSA, we need to look at the way others think, right? And we need to sort of embed ourselves with or soak ourselves in the sort of radical skepticism, and constantly ask, how far is, you know, whatever is being said true, and when is it not true? So that means, I mean, normally people read with the grain, so you go with what's being said, but, you know, critical analysis requires that we read against the grain. So, but we need to read that against the grain on everything: scholars, statistics, public discourse, policies, interview transcripts as well, what people say to us. And we need to be looking for biases, silences, exclusions, stereotypes, and assumptions. And we also need to be asking ourselves about power dynamics and who benefits and who loses from this particular interpretation of what's going on, including in our interviews, right? When we meet people, we need to be read against the grain of what they're saying. You know, it's their partial viewpoint at whose efforts, relationships are being silenced, whose loss is being not recognized, etc. So this reading against the grain, we need to apply this to our own research, and we need to look at what would make our work true, right? So rather than generalizations, to go in detail to nuance and detail, and we need to really dig into it rather than just accept and count. You know, so many people say this is what people say, etc., but actually go, you know, why do people say this? So we need to look at multiple viewpoints, because all viewpoints are partial, and we need to embrace dissonance and try and see those as productive and creative and try and understand why. So I remember one time when I was doing a piece of research in rural India, all the landowners were saying, oh, nobody ever comes for work, while the laborers who just brought in on a daily basis for work, so there's no work, right? And I couldn't make either of those two stack together, and it just, you know, what's going on here? And of course, from the farmer's point of view, they had bottlenecks in their work, which work had to be done in 3 days, otherwise the crop would be lost or the water wouldn't be there or whatever. And they couldn't get enough people for those crunches. But from the workers' point of view, there was only a small amount of work seasonally, and most of the time there was no work. So there's real need to embrace dissonance that you find in your work, because that's where the creativity is and the new knowledge. Can we move on then, please? So in terms of walking towards DSA Part 3, we need to look at the politics of representation. That is the politics of our work, the way we represent what we find. So all of our outputs become part of the discourse, the public discourse. And what we need to recognize is that what we say won't necessarily be read as we expected, that what we say can be appropriated and it can be flipped. And one of the examples I have of this is that, which was quite shocking, because I thought I covered all bases. And I've been talking about how older people work and how they need to be given pensions so that they can manage their work, do as much as they wanted, take days off when they were unwell, etc., go to the hospital or whatever. And Modi, the Prime Minister, just coming in at that time in 2014, said, well, if people want money, I was arguing for pensions, if people want money, they can work, right? So my argument got flipped, and it was, fortunately, nobody else seems to have repeated that, but that's it. You know, you have to be careful of how people can take your work. So you have to be careful of multiple readings. You have to be careful of buttressing stereotypes in your writing, and how what you write can drive negative policies. So while we're all good at justifying our work and methods, I've started asking people this question that I'm going to come to, which takes people by surprise, and it's quite interesting how people often aren't able or aren't prepared to talk about it in public, the limits of their work. So we need to ask ourselves, what are the risks of our language, our concepts, our approach, our assumptions, and methods and analysis? What risks do they run for people? So, and this also brings us back to ethics as well, because a lot of social science ethics is modeled on the sort of medicalized model of ethics. You know, you don't do harm to the individuals that you're interviewing, but actually we need a socio-political model of ethics where we don't do harm to the groups of people who become identified through your work, who become represented through your work. So if you are talking about, I don't know, street vendors, you talk to 10, but all street vendors are now going to be characterized by this work. So what we need to do is we need to close out those risks about the representational risks that we in our production of our work. Okay, thank you for whoever did that. Next, right. Okay, so looking at the papers, I just want to talk briefly about social sciences. So first of all, most social science disciplines started out about 100 to 150 years ago in Europe and North America. And that if they claim antecedents, they're claiming antecedents from European philosophers, a few European philosophers. So we have the twin projects of colonialism and coloniality, which is, as I would define it here anyway, the colonizing of everyone's minds, not just people in the colonies, but everybody's mind, right? Because you need to have people, sort of people who work for the colonial power. So, you know, people orientate, you know, come from Britain or Scotland or wherever, who go to the colonies. They also need to think in these kinds of ways. So obviously not everybody was, but that was the project. And the thing that's also of interest is that, you know, colonialism enabled economies to have the space for non-productive thinkers to make a living out of providing universal knowledge. And I was quite taken when I went on holiday and somebody to a small country in Europe, and somebody said, oh, how extraordinary your work is. Wish we could do that, but we don't have an economy big enough to support people like you. And I thought, yep, you're right. I don't make my, I don't grow the food I eat, etc. So we need to have a wealthy enough economy to pay for people like me to produce what is classed as universal knowledge. So, part of this, you know, coloniality is the idea of producing knowledge of universal salience. The assumption is the universal salience of European and North American values, knowledge, and perspectives, which is, you know, totally what you see in, you know, international development and so on. And the other assumption is the universal applicability of European or North American experience and that trajectory, which again is what you see in international development, the idea of modernization, and everybody's going to become like America. This sort of twin project and these ideas of universal salience drive the production of an unreflexive disciplinary dogma, which is inappropriate to non-European context. Now that is, you know, one thread of the argument about decolonizing knowledge. But we know now that we have people coming into the academy that actually it's not even true, that kind of perspective, that much research in Europe and North America and North American countries was and continue to be undertaken by unreflexive, privileged people utilizing top-down methodologies, theories and methods, to reproduce a disciplinary dogma inappropriate even for the European and North American context. And when I say that, the thing is that you yourselves need to realize that in your own countries, and I in my country, sit in that position of being privileged, right? So we have to be wary of ourselves in how we approach work on people with outside our class. Okay, can we move to the next one? Right. So the papers, is that, sorry, is that, can we go back just one? Because have we skipped one? Or it's just in my mind? Okay, no. I'm not sure if I was going to state this, but one of the things I was going to, right. So just to finish up on that last one, which I thought I'd written something in, maybe it'll come later. But yes, so there's work done by Mullins on North America, which points out how, you know, the idea of life, which is, it comes in the papers, but the idea of life as learn, earn, retire, didn't actually fit women's experience. So was the idea that it was universal didn't fit women's experience, didn't fit minority groups' experience, that it only fitted the experience of white collar and unionized workers. So what I'm saying is that universal knowledge, what's considered to be universal, doesn't actually even necessarily fit Europe and North America. So in that sense, we need to decolonize colonize everybody's thinking about everything, really, and we're part of the body that needs to have our thinking decolonized. Okay, so moving on to this, so we're looking at the nexus of political, public, and scientific discourse. Scientific discourse isn't outside, society. So this demonstrates how states attempt to redefine family relations, define and redefine family relations. So this is paper 2, in order to legitimate states' action or inaction, and in order to shape population and state relations. And this is sort of the kind of thing that Foucault talks about, as well as others. So in this context, identities are mobilized in support of state or vested interests, and privileged voices are the loudest. They're the ones who have the access. They're the ones who have the means to write to the paper, or they're the ones who are politicians and so on. So their voices are the loudest, and they set the sort of what's considered to be norms and interests. So it's a sort of hegemonic placing that these privileged middle class and educated voices have. So disadvantaged people are stigmatized in these contexts because they don't fit what is considered to be the norm. But the problem is that it stigmatizes people rather than actually the context, which doesn't allow them to necessarily fit the norm. So, is it the people themselves or the disadvantaged that is the issue? And discourses on family relations are always over personalized. They always bring it back to, there isn't the love, etc., changing the values, etc., rather than looking at the context that enables something to happen. So what you end up with is also a situation where at different levels, people are being required to conform. So at the state level, community level, at the family and the individual level. So you get this enforcement, particularly within communities, which tends often not to be part of most people's research. If people do research on the family, they look at what's happening in the household, and they don't look at the context outside the household and how that looks into the household and determines what's going on. So we need to see this community as enforcer. That's usually the local enforcer, and the family is a mix of shared and divided interests. And we cannot take any one person's viewpoint as truth. It's always partial. They might be conforming to what's expected of them. They might have interests in hiding or pushing forward things. You can go to interview people where people will use that opportunity to complain about others, but in front of others, which they wouldn't normally do. So you can tell it's a performance. What you're getting is a performance, not actually something that might be seen as just their viewpoint. It's a performance. It's an opportunity to say something to others. And so you need to not just ask what is happening in interviews and so on. You need to ask why it's happening, and you need to ask the what if question. So if you've got somebody saying that they do X and it's only them that does it, you need to ask why, and then what if you can't do it? Because actually the contingencies of life and the daily experience of everyday exception. So every day becomes an exception, as we all know. Somebody takes kids to school, but every day they're asking somebody else to help them because they've got something else come on. So the contingencies of life, and you need to ask, what if you can't do it? Who steps in, or etc. So that's just in terms of family care, maybe. Okay, so the next slide. So coming to the end, and trying to bring all this together. So it's a non-stop process, and we're working towards a decolonial sociology of aging. And what we need, this is my viewpoint, obviously. This is what I'm suggesting, and maybe I'll think differently another time, but what we need is radical skepticism towards concepts, theories, received knowledge, received evidence, methodologies of skepticism about what we think and what people and participants say. And we need to ask, why do people say what they say? How partial and predictable is it? Because what happens is people give you the answers they think that they should give you. And it may also be that that's actually what they think that is happening. One of the things that Malinowski said, sort of the founder of anthropology in Britain, was that people will tell you what should happen, but when you go and watch, that's not happening. Something else is happening. So you need to see those, the sort of the idea of the norm and actually what happens in practice. So, and you need to think about what your role is in the saying, your role is in the hearing, your role is in the representing, and what the consequences can be, right, of what your work is. So this means not thinking that we can launch ourselves from the accepted knowledge foundations and just do our research, right? This has been found, etc. Now we'll move off from that. We accept those concepts and so on. We need to interrogate the foundations for their applicability in each context. And we need to remember that there are no universals, there are no national norms, right? Because things are always come down to context on the day, right? In the context. And one of the things that I think is completely under examined is domestic demographies. So one might have a sort of sexual division of labor or an age and sexual division of labor. If those people don't exist in your household, somebody else is doing it, right? So that's an area that really isn't examined, I think, enough. So everything is nuanced, everything is contingent, and everything is relational. So for instance, just taking that point up in India, women do the cleaning and the cooking and the washing of people's clothing. But if there isn't a woman to do it because she's unwell or whatever, then the question is, who can do it? And certain activities have to be the one closest to the woman, and certain activities which might be a woman, right, closest to the woman who should be doing it. But certain activities, if there isn't a woman, it has to be the male that is least close to being an adult male. So it will be a young boy who will do those activities. So they may cook, they may do the washing, etc. So we need to focus on nuance, contingency, and relationality. I think that's the end.
Thanks, Benny. Really appreciate those insights and the tour through a decolonial sociology of not just aging, but of many a much wider sweep through, and quite practical too, of what we need to do and think and consider as we embark on our work and our everyday lives too. So what we've decided is what we thought we would do is we'd ask Jasmine, I see, is in the room, and maybe to start a conversation with you in relation to the two chapters and any questions or queries you had. And I see that Gwen is also here. So perhaps, Jasmine, if you want to start, if that's okay, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Penny Vera-Sanso, for a beautiful presentation and very reflexive positions regarding the two papers. I must admit I find a very, very beautiful addition to the dimensional theory, coming from a background of demography myself. And I really liked it, particularly when you in the first paper that looks at how we construct, actually already focused on how we construct on the how population has changed and leaving out other persons, and on the demographic transitional theory. Yes, it's very beautiful critique. And in the first place, it really pushes out. Actually, there's nothing about other persons in demographic theory, because the focus is mainly declining of fertility, birth rates, and death rates, and also the application of it. Think that what occurred in the North Europe will also apply in the list of developing countries, which hasn't been the case. And when you also look at, if you allow me an extension, that what they call the second demographic transition, um, the context of other persons only comes in for very advanced countries, but developing countries do not appear. And the issue mainly, and we also look at that how, in relation to Thomas Matthews earlier on, who look at the relationship between wage and only focused on men's contribution to income, and pressing out women. And there's nothing, perhaps it's about maybe the time when mortality was very high and some of the issues. But I just have one of the issues just looking at this, how we can, as researchers, apply in the context, particularly in the developing countries. Because most of these theories, as well articulated in the first paper, apply to the developed countries, and we need to contextualize domesticated demography and apply in the developing countries. Now, I wanted to ask on the issue on the other persons, particularly how they can, in the labor market, how they can compete in the economy. Bear in mind, if you consider other persons, probably they were born, those who are born when they did not have privileges in terms of access to education, and the young ones, they have all those benefits, opportunities to learning, and they may have the skills to compete in the job. But as the other person's age, they may have less skills. How do we place in these dynamics when we see that that other persons may be less at a disadvantage compared to the young ones who may have skills um, in terms of how they can care for themselves? So I think
Okay.
that, yes. I don't know
Okay.
if I should move on to the paper two, or
Can I just deal with one at a time?
okay, all right.
Okay. So, and when you say care for themselves, you mean provide for themselves, I presume.
Yes, yeah.
So, okay. So, okay. So this is the field that I'm sort of in India. That's my main concern in India is about older people and work. So, or supporting themselves or lack of work. So what I found is, first of all, the very first thing is that people, I mean, I don't know the African context. The last time I was in Africa, I was in Zambia in '97. So you'll have to bear with me on that. But so from the Indian context, older people work. It's just that it's not seen. You can actually go. We the, I think most people have this, where in their mind they think of workers as being what we call prime age, and you can actually walk down a street and not see the older person working. And I've been with lots of people who do this. I had to train myself to see older people myself. It was quite interesting that people can walk down the street and not trip over an older person who's selling something, like you don't trip over the roots of the tree, but not actually see them. Yeah. So we're quite selective in what we see. And I got to the point where I only saw older workers because I was selecting them all the time. I didn't really see younger workers. So that's the first thing. People are there, right? They do work and we just don't see them. Secondly, when older people work, they're very often defined as not working. So you'll get somebody who's helping somebody else out and they'll be defined as passing time. So not working. And I had this one lovely example where I was talking to a woman who was doing this ironing work outside a block of flats, middle-class flats. And she had her mother-in-law was sitting on the floor. And the woman was, so the job was ironing. So the woman was doing the ironing and her mother was sitting on the floor. But what was her mother doing? Her mother was opening all the bags of clothing and checking them for rips and stains and burns. Because she was, as I say, she was the legal department, right? She was going to say, oh, this is, this isn't our damage, etc. So she was the legal department. But because it wasn't the job of ironing, she was classed as just passing time, not working. But she made the other person's work much quicker, right? So it was more productive. So people are working, we don't see them. People are misrepresented or misunderstood. And the older woman, easily recognized that think she's not working as well, or why have an argument about it? And so people often get classed as helping when they're not, right? They're actually like they've passed the job on to the younger man because he needs a job in order to get married, but actually she's still running the show. So there's loads of things like that. People selling, older people selling. So coming back to, so a lot of jobs don't actually need training skills, right? They're all the ones that that we need people to sell things. We need people to collect food and so on from other places and bring them to our local area so that so that we can carry on with our lives, conveniently, etc. So there are lots of jobs, little trade jobs, little building jobs, lots of jobs that people do that we're just not recognizing them for actually what they are, and then who does them. So what actually do people do? The real issues about people is not skills, but the local economy. So if there isn't work for young people, you will, and this may apply more in your own countries than it necessarily does in others. Younger people will occupy those jobs. But if there is better jobs, they'll move out, and older people will move into those. And you can see this happening. Actually within big cities when there's an economic crunch and young people drop down the sort of the employment ladder, so they'll come off building sites and they'll start standing in the street for those small little jobs that older people normally take, do a little bit of plastering, do a little bit of electrical work, etc. And then those older people will actually lose their work until the building construction site is now open again, and younger people go to those, and then there'll be space for them. So they become a reserve army of labor, which is a tough place to be.
Jasmine, would you like to pose a second question there?
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Penny Vera-Sanso. The second question I had on paper 2, yes, that really talks mostly on redefining what a household should be, and the discourse around the family dynamics. Quite interesting paper, particularly when you look at the classic definition of what a household by the UN is about, people sharing the same pot. But interestingly, with for example, rural-urban migration, there is a denuclearization. So there's nuclearization of the family, and that really talks about the example you've given from the Indian perspective. Mine is the question I would like to pose is related to policy. Like with these different, obviously, with the projections going forward, we are going. Or if we assume that as urbanization takes place, households size or members are going to be smaller, and there's a need to redefine in terms of the context, the relations in the household, how care or help, assistance is coming from, and the relationship. Now, in terms of policy, what should be done as policy to expand this definition of household? Bearing in mind that what used to be the household now is defined as a household is completely changing, and there's a need to have a new definition on that. I'm asking this because I have participated in some of the large household questions to pose a small or to include one question. There's always dimensions that's going to be very costly to ask all those questions, for example, in censuses. So usually there's a rigidity around us asking some of the questions and even including questions that relate to other persons. So usually the data around this is usually scanty. So as policy, if we are to lay out a new framework in terms of defining household or family relations, what can the policy do in this aspect?
Okay, so when I do a household survey, I learned from bitter experience that you don't ask who's in the family, because you don't necessarily find out who is sharing that pot under what terms. So I've done a survey recently in Sierra Leone, and that we ask who stays in the household and how are they related to the head of the household. And so you can, I mean, the problem is it's not in the collection. Well, I mean, that's, you have to train the people who are collecting to really understand, but it's in the analysis then. So, you have to trace back who's where. And so, for instance, in Sierra Leone, this survey, I didn't do the survey, somebody else did the survey. We're finding that, quite a lot of people, so there's sort of compound households, so there are lots of different parts, and we ask if there are there people living in your area that are related to you. So, but at least at the household level, even if you don't do that, at least at the household level, you can ask how people are related, and so you'll find people who are I think the language is adopted or whatever, but you find people who are moving and staying with people, so that you get this sort of linkage between urban and rural. But the question is really, why are you doing a household survey anyway? Why are you doing a census? Yeah, and that's that's the sort of question, because actually, yeah, why do governments do censuses? I mean, in England, they're going to start doing them now. They're going to gather the information from our digital profiles.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. I'm going to have to move on. Just to add, sorry, is that the inclusion of Jasmine and Gwen and Janet, for example, in the questions I didn't mention earlier, is that they are the country leads for our family caregiving of older persons program. That actually Penny is also going to support us on that program. And so Dr. Jasmine Chinsanya there is leading the work in Malawi. And next up is Dr. Gwen Lesotedi, and she's working in Botswana. So Gwen, lovely to have you here.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. A very interesting discussion, and I enjoyed listening to the papers. But before I proceed, I want to say apologies on behalf of Dolly. She's not well, but she read the papers. And Elena, if you may allow me, instead of me asking the questions, my questions first, can I start off by asking Dolly's questions?
Yeah, please, by all means.
Okay.
By all means.
So Elena, Dolly did go through the papers, and she noted some questions. So the first question is to do with the presenter's argument that young people are dependent on older people for resources. But looking at the Botswana situation, studies in Botswana do support this. And what you usually find is that the old age pension, which is very little, is often shared with dependents. It becomes like it's a resources for the whole family. So she's asking, in your view, Penny, um, what interventions must developing countries put in place in order to address this inadequate social protection for older persons? Is there something that can be done from a policy point of view?
Well, the two things. One is obviously raise the sum of the pension, and maybe I'll talk about this other point. It's a sort of larger point about development, which is that we, in the international development, we tend to think of the people own their own incomes, right? So when you go out and work, you earn the money for yourself, and you might share it with the family. But in fact, actually, certainly in Britain, nobody earns their if you're married and got kids, you don't earn the income for yourself alone, because the law requires you to look after others. But there's this sort of idea that if you lift people out of their poverty, individuals out of their poverty, it will carry them through for the rest of their lives. But what we find, and in many places, and which you're describing, is that as one gets older, others start to say, well, we have needs as well, and so you have to start to share a bit more obviously than maybe one was supposed to be sharing before, the way people talked about it. So, and older people will not, in my experience, say, no, I'll have, it's my money, or I'll have the milk and let the child, go hungry, etc. So what happens? So this is the relational perspective. So what happens is older people will start to will not benefit from as much from whatever government does towards them if everybody else is very short, right? If there isn't provision for everybody. So clearly, if the pension is not enough, then there needs to be more pension, but there needs to be jobs. Why? What's happening that jobs aren't being created? There's loads of things that could be done to create jobs. I mean, just
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of countries, when there's economic downturns, you invest in order to give people jobs, in order to the money circulates and so on. So I'm getting beyond my own field of knowledge, but there is that point that families, older people are part of families and communities, and they can't say no, and they don't want to say no, and it's in nobody's interest to say no, because at some point you may become more dependent. Everybody is, contingencies of life, everybody's precarious in some sort of way, whether it's economically or physically or emotionally or whatever. So we're all intermeshed, we all have mutual needs. I hope that answers.
No, it does. In a way, you are saying we shouldn't just focus on, policies shouldn't just be about raising the pension, but it should be a holistic approach, create more jobs and so on. Yeah. No, yeah. And then the second question is with reference to research methods. Dolly is asking, what research methods would you propose, that you think that are relevant to the researchers in developing countries that are not driven by Western ways of knowledge?
Okay, so the first thing, I actually do mixed methods research, and I've done research on, this is as an anthropologist, right? My problem is that I was, the international development when I was an undergraduate was in geography. And so in geography, there's very much about, having large numbers of people. And I was never very confident in having small groups of people, but then, so I always wanted, so I did, as I said, 110 households, or somebody else might have called it 156 households, which for an anthropologist is really massive. And then I went on, because people, don't listen to you if you have small numbers. Policymakers don't listen to you. But if you have an 800 household survey, they go, oh, because, I was doing 800 household surveys in Chennai when the government, the national government census people were doing 920 households in Chennai. So I was at national level, right? But the only way you can do that, I think, and come up with something that you might call truth or sensitive or anything, something that I would stand behind for myself, is that you do the qualitative stuff first, and then you do the survey stuff. So when I was a student, PhD student, I wouldn't define my questions. I had subject areas. So I wanted to talk to households about work. That was it. Tell me about work. What should I know about work to understand what's going on in your life, your experiences? And then I had about 10 or 15 households that that were really engaged with my work. So we'd have long chats, and each household would tell me a bit more. So, you know, I'd go to them and say, you know, whatever, what I'd started picking up. And then they'd say, oh, you know about that. Okay. And they'd take me further along the line. It was like really like educating a child. But when I got to the point where I'd sort of had more or less saturation, as they say, which I think is a really horrible concept, as though everybody's the same, I would then take those to the rest of the household. So I'd sort of got semi-structured interviews at that point, and I'd take those to the rest of the house, the other households, and I'd start to notice differences between households where things didn't apply. And then I'd go back again and I'd work on, you know, so that would be the sort of production. Then I'd work on, you know, consumption, domestic relations. So I keep going through batches, right? But since then, because I've worked in those areas and I have a pretty good understanding of how things are, I'm now able to do, you know, to structure questionnaires and so on, building on that experience and that knowledge. So that's how I was then able to use, you know, produce an 800 household survey, which I think sort of made sense. And then I would supplement that with semi-structured interviews. But by that time, I knew the communities, was going back to them periodically over time and stuff.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe now I can move on to my two questions. My first question is in reference to the demographic transition, you know, how the demographic transition shows the population structure and so on. But out of curiosity, can one say that COVID-19, you know, okay, maybe not a lot of studies have been done, but COVID-19 almost wiped out communities, families, and so on. Is it possible to say what impact it has on the demographic structure of families, the nations, and so on? Is it possible to, or we need to wait until, you know, like the demographic transition, we just didn't pounce upon it. It was a trend, you know, we looked at the trends and so on. But how about with COVID-19? Because the way it came, it was so devastating. Within 2 years, almost everything had changed. So that's my question, the impact of COVID-19, yes.
Okay, so I'm not going to answer that question in that way, right?
Yeah.
And the reason why is I don't have the data on it. But I can tell you what happens with poverty, and there is data on this. So the thing about poverty, which, you know, this might not be just economic poverty. It might be the fact you're a very long way away from healthcare, or it might be that everybody's working and nobody can take you to attend a clinic or whatever. So the deprivations, okay, rather than poverty. So the problem with this is there is a social gradient. Professor Michael Marmot has written on this, and I use his work all the time. There is a social gradient in health and morbidity. So the you know, people who are less sort of more deprived, let's say, you know, suffering in the ways that they may suffer, just might be their location or their economics, or, you know, the number of people in their households, etc. You know, some people don't have kids and some people's kids haven't survived, etc. So what's happening is that you get this social gradient. So people are dying earlier, people are sicker, there are real holes in people's family networks and households. And as I said in that paper, it's surprising how many men die off, because I mean, we know women live longer, but do they live longer, or is it just that men are dying earlier? And of course they're the ones with that earn the most, usually in many economies, because the gender wage gap, and also so you end up with families who are now stuck with, all that's left in their family are older people, young people, a lot of women, etc. And the problem with these being stuck with this lot is that the society is organized against these people. So that's organized, around age and gender wage disparities, right? So so I think that kind of analysis could be fed back into what is the effect of COVID.
Okay, thank you. Now, my last question is more to do with the issue of universal knowledge, or when you look at the concepts of the colonized and the colonial, and yeah, let me just focus on the issue of colonialism and coloniality. When we look at the global world right now, it's very difficult, with the social media and everything. There's so much going on, globalization. Is it possible, or should I, let me say, don't you think that both sectors, the colonized and the knowers of knowledge, let me say those who think they know, don't you think there are intersections where we feed upon each other,
Yeah.
where we get knowledge from the global north, and then we also do have an impact on knowledge from our part? Don't you think there are a lot of interconnections through globalization, or even just through people, diaspora? I come from Africa, I do research in the UK, or I do research in North America. Don't you think there are a lot of intersections, so that we reach a point where now we are both contributing, even though maybe some might contribute more, others might contribute less? I think it's more of a comment, or it's an observation more than a question.
Yeah, I mean, my problem, I think you're totally right. Everybody's contributing. Then I know that people have, there are arguments about, the status that people get from their contributions, and there's also the what gets counted as knowledge and so on. And that's really about disciplinary sort of dogmas and, power structures within disciplines. But I mean, that's why I wanted to say the thing about, that it doesn't matter where you're located, everybody has gone through a process of sort of colonization of the mind, so that we're all being sort of pressed into following particular kind of viewpoints. So all of us have to fight it. And what's interesting is that as more people come into the academy or get places in policy or so on, there are more different experiences are coming forward, and people noticing gaps because they're seeing that they're not being represented or their experience is not included. But then you still have that sort of gatekeeping. So yes, it's improving, but we have to I suppose, be constantly reflexive and also open the doors to other viewpoints, recognize the partiality of our viewpoint, and so on.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gwen, and thanks, Penny, for that. I'm going to open it up as soon, because otherwise we're going to lose time. I have two quick questions. I'm going to ask you them both, if you don't mind. I mean, there's three, but they're all speaking to the same thing in reality. I could go on. I'm sure we could go on all day. Central to your papers, and both of them, if you're looking at them collectively, is these dominant discourses that circulate and not only control the way we think and see, but also have particular agendas, right? They're powerful mechanisms, as we know from Foucault and others. So I'm going to give you three examples that I think circulate particularly globally, but also locally. And again, we could run seminars on these alone, but just to perhaps consider a bit. The first one is related to the decade of healthy aging. What I'm asking is, like, what does this global policy framework actually do? We hear it in conversations at every level, whether I'm not just talking about academia, I'm not just talking about policy. You know, in our current work, I might be in a meeting with a very local organization, and I might in the next day be in a meeting with, you know, someone from a kind of almost a global NGO. And both are saying the same thing, that this particular agenda or this particular framework is not being implemented, doesn't resonate, and actually has no sway. And I say locally, I mean like regionally in Southern Africa, but also locally in this particular community, this particular part of South Africa, let's say, right? It gets incredible attention everywhere. You see it globally, you know, and I don't need to tell you that. I know you know that. So what is it doing? And should we even bother to engage? I say this with a pinch of salt because I know, you know, it's there. We know it's irrelevance, and it's not taken. And when I say it's not taken seriously, it's really just there. Like it's like this, you know, elephant in the room almost. Like they have to attend to it, but no, but it's not relevant. Well, the elephant in the room is relevant. So that's the first one, right? The second one is a bit more practical, and again, it's not unique to South Africa. It's about the failing family discourse. That rhetoric penetrates so deep, again, at every level. We see it in our current program as well, at the community level. It pits all these tensions of home-based carers against family caregivers, of social workers against, you know, clinic nurses, and everyone is kind of blaming, for want of a better word, you know, or putting kind of responsibility on others. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't connect people together. It doesn't mobilize multiple types of caregivers, you know, who are either paid or unpaid at a local level or beyond in ways that are helpful. So how is it that we can kind of move away from, and I say this very much at a local level. I'm not so, we see it at national level all the time. We see it's like, it's the danger it does there. But even at a local level, which I think is probably easier to address at times, not completely, like not easy or straightforward. But how do we work with seeing the conditions of care in particularly under-resourced areas and in particular communities, both as onlookers and insiders? And how do we reframe those kinds of ways of seeing for ourselves, needless to say, but also for others, and particularly for insiders? The last one, okay, relates to something that has just popped up in the conversation, and it's about this idea of fluidity of families and interdependence and census data. We've been in meetings where we're told if we can prove that the older person's grant is being redistributed to 5 people, like what is that number that will allow us to say it's a problem? And that's where I think the problem with, you know, with we need at times to quantify it because it's as much as we don't want to do it, and as much as we want to try and unearth the nuances and the complexity of, let's say, the redistribution of a pension, sometimes having answers to those questions might be helpful. And I hate to say these things because, like, I don't, you know, one doesn't want to be able to put a number that if the, let's call it a dependency ratio of the older person's grant is 4+, then suddenly it'll be more. You know, like in France, for example, if you have X amount more children, you get more in terms of social support grants, you know, for child support grants. The third kid, or at least they used to, I don't know if they do this anymore. And there are all these incentives to do that type of thing. So how do we deal with that type of response from government that does ask the question, what is the ratio, you know, of how many older persons are redistributing this grant to 4 or more people, full stop? Okay, sorry, that's quite a lot. Thanks,
Okay.
Penny.
That's all right. So I don't know if I've sent it to you, but anyway, I've got a paper that's been submitted and is going to be looked at and might be out later in this year about the decade of healthy aging. So the answer about the decade of healthy aging is that actually basically the UN has been moving towards, I mean, the UN started out in the 1950s and so on, thinking that state was responsible for everything, and things haven't moved on. So they've now increasingly moved towards the idea of the private sector as funding development. and the sort of civics, the NGO sector and so on, but particularly the private sector. And so the decade of healthy aging is, as far as what's happening is they're not going to meet their SDGs. And so they're putting in the last 10 years or 9 years, whatever it's going to be, they're trying to push it forward so that they can meet their SDG targets. And they're trying to bring private sector in. And of course, the history of private sector involvement is that they've got to take they've got to take a percentage, they've got to take a profit. And in order to do so, they focus on small projects or particular projects, and that tends to draw money off from other areas of healthcare that the government would provide. So the decade of healthy aging, and it's the decade of healthy aging. If you look at it, it's about NCDs and it's about people under the age of 70. So that's the SDGs. So it's backing up this. So in order to hit targets, it's very likely that governments are going to move money away from looking after older people in order to hit the target for NCD reduction for people under 70. So it's actually got ageism built right into it. It's got capitalist agendas built right into it. And I think that it can only be detrimental for the people. I think it will increase inequalities, right? Health inequality. So the failing discourse and divisive and reframing, the notes I've taken from question 2. I think one of the things that I have done, and I think it's been quite useful, is the use of photography, because people really respond to photography, but also you have to be careful. Because in the people, if you take a photo, if you just give somebody a photograph and you don't give them a context for understanding that photograph, so I literally go back and to write little, words about what's happening, they will take that photograph and they will fit it into their own perception. So if they see an older person working, I did a whole thing on trying to get older people recognized for working. They'll take that picture and they'll see an older person and they'll think, oh, poor thing, family's not looking after them, right? But you don't want that. You want to say, this person is contributing to their family. They're helping to distribute vegetables from the wholesale market to your door. So you reframe it in a positive sort of way. And it may be that, but there's obviously there's a problem about communities knowing individuals, but it may be that you could have a sort of sort of photographic thing or some way of, or some meetings or whatever, but somehow to bring the community to frame things in a different way, to lead that framing. So photography or group sessions or whatever, something of that sort is what I would suggest. And bringing your different people together that you were talking about, the different care providers and so on. And then the redistribution is a problem. Now I think you just have to, with policymakers, you have to talk the talk that they understand, but adjust it. So for instance, the poverty ratio, which I didn't realize, or the sort of the minimum needs, the poverty line, is actually I had no idea until I just wrote this paper. It has stunting embedded in the ratio, right? I mean, you normally think that what comes out of the UN might be good, but it has stunting embedded in it, because what it does is it works on the basis of sort of an average calorific need, which is based on height, right? So if you're in a nation that has nutritional problems and stunting, it's embedded in what the poverty line sits in. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So it started out with a sort of racism, probably, where people probably thought, oh, certain groups, use races, all right, let's use the term, are naturally shorter, sort of like Bangladesh by comparison to Norway. But actually, now that we know that people grow to the height that they're nutritionally enabled to do so because they've had the right food. Now we realize that stunting is embedded into poverty lines. It is continuous. So what you need to do, I would have said, was to actually do this numerical survey, set a poverty line that is reasonable, that doesn't embed disadvantage, that carries on throughout life, all right? So it doesn't matter how wealthy you get. The material on NCDs suggests that no matter how wealthy you become, your early life affects, your later life health. Take all this information that is accepted and present it and show that, this many people are living off this sum of money. That means that they are this that there is this level of this gap in their needs. That's what I do. You have to talk to them with the language they understand.
Thanks, Penny. Thanks. I'm going to open it up now. I see we have 15 minutes, just under 15 minutes. If you don't mind, Penny, what we're going to do, I think, is we'll take questions in a group. Otherwise, it's might take too long. So everyone, if you can put your hand up, it sounds like we're in a classroom. But if we could, I see Veda has her hand up. You go ahead, and I'll look at the chat to see if there are any other questions that have been posed. Go ahead, Veda.
Okay, thank you so much, Penny. That was very interesting, and also I think it's very useful for a lot of us who are on here who aren't necessarily in gerontology. So I have two questions. My one question is not necessarily about theory or research itself, but it's more about like early career researchers. And you were speaking about how essential it is for us to have money to think beyond this idea of universal knowledge. And I think this also relates to Gwen's last question. And also it's embedded in this idea of, well, we need certain amount of people in a sample to be able for people to take our research more seriously. And like looking so specifically in South Africa, like from my perspective, how does this work, like this idea of needing to have money to be able to do research and to be able to do like a decolonial form of research where we're asking different questions and we're reframing policy and the way in which we think about people and how we represent them. But when we're in the academy and in institutions, and if we look at how we think about the UN, it's difficult for early career researchers to start posing these other questions, to pose different representations, to reframe things when the people who have the money or distribute the money or have power in these institutions are not necessarily thinking in a way that is congruent with our own ways of thinking or a decolonial way of thinking. And we kind of have to like play the game until we get to a certain level of our career where we can acquire our own funding and push our own narratives, if that makes sense. So I think it's more for like, this question is more for the young researchers in this group of being like, how do we play this tightrope of wanting to move discourse into a different framing, but also having to like play the game of where the academy is, where the UN, where global policy, where just discourse is at the same time. Because if we came out like guns blazing, we probably wouldn't get jobs. You know what I mean? So it's also like about our own livelihood and our own career trajectory, but also about like what we morally think is right in how we represent people and what knowledge we choose to put out into the world. So that was my first question. And then my second question relates to your point about photography. So this is something that like we discuss quite a bit. I think also like younger generations, we respond much better to photography, I think, because of social media. But the problem is within the academy and in research, what is the ethics around photography? And especially when it comes to, for example, the family caregiving program, is when we're speaking to people who are vulnerable and are in context that actually people haven't really seen. But how do we, again, like thread this line of the notion of like the medicalization of ethics? So it's like do no harm and anonymity and confidentiality, but then also like we do believe it would be important and people would respond better to our research if they were actually able to see, because like reading about someone's context and how embedded families are and how important, especially in South Africa, older people are to the well-being of younger people, especially in South Africa when we look at our unemployment rates. But how do we do this with still being ethical when we understand that ethics is still very medicalized, if that makes sense?
Shall I answer this question?
Please,
Okay.
yeah. I don't see any other hands up at the moment, so fire ahead. There's a bit there.
Okay. What kind of work do you do, Veda?
So I work for the family caregiving program, and my own research is on the COVID grants in South Africa, which is the cohorts of South Africans who are unemployed, able-bodied, and working age, but do not have work opportunities, if that makes sense. And a lot of it is bedded within the family and the household.
So do you work by surveys, or do you work by qualitative research methods?
Qualitative.
Okay, so in terms of money, I mean, I'm sort of at the end of life, academic life, coming towards the end, and we're all fighting for money, which doesn't help. And and getting publications, we're all sort of kicked back and so on. So this is a common feature. Okay, so it doesn't just happen to early career researchers. If you're doing qualitative stuff, then it's normally possible. It depends on your contract and so on, to be able to do small pilot study kind of things that you write up, and then you use that. You write up and try and get it published. So you have to find the right place to publish it, even if it's not the best journal in the world. Somebody publishes it, then it can be used towards getting a grant, right? So it's just like that. I mean, I, for instance, have just put into the British Academy and didn't get it. The British Academy now have a new way of doing things, which is you have to meet a certain standard, and then they literally put everybody who meets the standard into a lottery, and then they pull it out, right? So
Oh my word.
yeah, okay, it's not based on how good you are, it's a lottery. And I'm going to put it in again. I think everybody will, and the lottery is going to get even bigger, and then they'll have a problem. But anyway, that made life easy for them. So yes, sample says you just have to work with others. You just have to think about what's feasible, what argument you can make, what label you can put on something. So if you say it's a pilot study, then and then it opens up spaces. So policy, you can read against the grain with policy. You don't need to actually, you can write articles that are just about policy. You bring in other people's research and so on. You don't actually have to do, in fact, it's quite hard to do qualitative research that relates to policy and so on. So you just have to find creative ways to get into what you're doing, and maybe building up small pieces of what you might call pilot work, or little bits that draw together and come to a bigger project that makes sense, and that you can put forward, and then you've got a history that people will give references to. Now the photography thing, that's a real problem, and I think the other thing that's an interesting problem is because ethics are getting more and more tight, which in many ways are getting unethical. And one of the unethical things is that actually the people who have the least voice are the ones that aren't named. Only get voice if you give it to them. They're not represented, whereas the powerful people in the world, they're seen everywhere. And it's an interesting ethical issue. People actually say, why am I not named? Yeah. And so, I mean, I too now have a problem with photography, because now I'm starting to use photography as a survey method, because just to see the size of people's businesses and how they've changed over time. These are vendors, right? Street vendors. And I can do that as long as I promise never to show any of those pictures. But even that's now starting to become a problem, So, I can see the stool and I can see the feet, but I can't, do other parts of the body. So even though people might like it. So, and I think the thing to do is we just have to keep writing about it. I mean, that would be a paper, wouldn't it? The ethics of anonymity. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. That's great. Thank you.
There is actually, on that note, there is a very good chapter in ethical quandaries on precisely that of, people in LGBTQI who have come out and want to be named in the research because they want to be named as a particular name because they have had experiences of coming out, and anonymizing them is putting back, is putting them back in a closet, etc. So there is a very good chapter written by Zetu Matabeni, who used to work at UCT. And yeah, I highly recommend that reading. I can share it with everyone if they're interested.
So I mean, you could do, for instance, you could do a paper that comes off that, and talk to some informants and say, how do you feel about these issues? And it feeds with then, and then if you can, you have to be strategic when you write. You think about, the whole drawing the discourse of decoloniality and control and people being able to speak for themselves and being recognized for it, and knowledge being appropriated, and all that kind of thing, and that's a paper. Even if you don't have a final resolution, you've opened up the subject for discussion, and that's a paper. Yeah.
Thanks, Benny. I'm looking to see if there are any other hands. Is anyone? I don't see any at the moment. Are there? And we are coming to time. It's 10:26 here. I'm sure it's 9:26 there. Any other comments? Veda has put the link of the book into the chat box. And I do also want to quickly advertise the seminar held at Birbeck, sorry, Penny, next week on Wednesday, I think it is, from 2 to 4 GMT. So that's probably 3 to 5 South African time, where there'll be a few of us talking about feminist ethics of care in Southern Africa and Ubuntu. So that's, next week. Thanks, Veda, for putting that in the chat box. I still don't see any other comments or questions. So on that note,
can I just say that you have to register for that? Yes.
Yeah, you have to register.
I'm really looking forward to that.
Actually had a postgraduate class and seminar on something very related, led by Vanessa, who will be presenting at that session next week, and it was fantastic, absolutely fantastic. So I'm very excited to hear more from our colleagues. Yeah, and otherwise I think we can close this off and thank Penny very much for her time, her effort, and her insights. Really appreciate that, Penny. And also for everybody attending and for having this discussion. So thanks, everybody. And thanks, Penny.
Thank you for your questions, because I always take away a lot from them. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Penny. And thanks, everybody. And have a good long weekend here in South Africa. I'm not sure about England.
Yes, we have to.
Yeah, I thought so.
It's not cold
Yeah.
Okay, bye, everyone.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.